There's one word that runs through the Gospel of John with unusual force: believe. In the Greek text behind the count we have been using, the verb pistuo appears about 98 times. And yet the related noun, pistis, usually translated faith, does not appear in the Gospel at all. That is an interesting fact, but it can also become a trap. Because once we hear it, we naturally want a simple explanation. Maybe John preferred action over ideas. Maybe he was trying to tell us that faith should be a verb, not a noun. Maybe if we just define the Greek word correctly, we will understand what John means every time he says someone believed. But John never tells us why he does not use the noun. And the Gospel itself gives us a reason to be careful before turning a word count into a complete theology. John clearly wants belief to matter. Near the end of the Gospel, he explains that the signs he's recorded were written so that people might believe. So the repeated word is not accidental background noise. It is central to what John is doing. But for a Christian trying to understand what genuine belief actually means, the harder question is not simply how many times John uses the word. It is this: when John tells us that different people believed in Jesus, is he describing the same kind of response every time? And if he is not, then what should we make of faith that begins through testimony, depends heavily on signs, develops slowly, or still struggles under fear? The first chapters of the Gospel make that question much harder than it appears, because very early in John we meet people who believe in Jesus, and Jesus responds in a way we may not expect. John chapter 2 takes us to Jerusalem during Passover. Jesus has performed signs. People have seen what he has done, and John says plainly that many believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. If we stop there, the passage sounds simple. They saw, they believed, case closed. But John does not stop there. He immediately adds that Jesus did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and did not need anyone to tell him what was in a person. There is an important detail hiding in English. The Greek verb translated believed in the first sentence is the same basic verb translated entrust in the next. The people pistuo in Jesus. Jesus does not pistuo himself to them. John places those two statements side by side. That does not mean we are free to declare exactly what happened inside every person's soul. The text does not give us a list of names and tell us which individuals were saved and which were not. It would go beyond the passage to pronounce a final spiritual verdict on every person in that crowd. But it would also go beyond the passage in the other direction to pretend that nothing unusual is happening. John says they believed. Then he immediately tells us that Jesus did not entrust himself to them. That means the word believe by itself has not yet told us everything we need to know about their response. Something about the surrounding context matters. What have they seen? What do they understand? What are they responding to? What does John show next? Those questions matter because the crowd in Jerusalem has seen signs, and that creates an obvious possibility. Maybe the problem is signs. Maybe John is contrasting a shallow faith based on miracles with a higher kind of faith that needs no evidence. That explanation sounds plausible until we keep reading, because John does not treat signs as the enemy of belief, not even close. Before the Jerusalem Passover scene, John has already shown us another response to a sign. At Cana, Jesus turns water into wine. John calls this the first of his signs, and he says that through it Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So a sign leads to belief there, and John reports it positively. Later, when a royal official comes to Jesus because his son is dying, signs appear again in the story. Jesus challenges the demand to see signs and wonders before believing. Yet the story does not end with Jesus condemning the man for seeking help. The official asks Jesus to come before his child dies. Jesus tells him that his son will live, and the man believes the word Jesus speaks and goes home. He leaves before he has seen the result. Only later does he receive confirmation that his son recovered at the very hour Jesus spoke. Then John again says that he believed, along with his household. So John will not allow us to build an easy formula. Signs can reveal. Signs can awaken belief. Jesus' works can testify to who he is, and near the end of the Gospel, John tells us directly that he selected signs for his readers for a reason. They are meant to lead somewhere. The problem, then, is not that a person encountered evidence. John is not teaching that mature faith means refusing evidence or believing without reasons. The issue is what happens with the evidence. A sign can draw attention to Jesus, but a sign does not interpret itself. Seeing power is not the same thing as already understanding fully who Jesus is, and the same kind of evidence can appear in stories where the response develops in very different ways. That is why John too matters so much. The Jerusalem crowd had seen something real. Their response was not invented, but John refuses to let the words "they believed" finish the story for us. We have to watch where belief goes. And John shows us another important path in Samaria. Not a spectacular sign this time, a testimony. In John chapter 4, a Samaritan woman returns to her town after speaking with Jesus. She tells the people about the man she has met. And John says that many Samaritans from that town believed in Jesus because of the woman's testimony. That matters. Their response begins through someone else's words. They have not yet had the same encounter she has had. They are responding to testimony. Then they come to Jesus themselves. They ask him to remain with them. He stays there 2 days. And more believe because of what they hear from him. Then they say to the woman, in effect, that now they believe not merely because of what she told them. They have heard for themselves, and they know that this man really is the Savior of the world. John does not tell us that the woman's testimony was worthless. He does not say their first response was fake. Her testimony does exactly what testimony is supposed to do. It points people toward Jesus. But once they encounter him, the basis of their confidence becomes fuller. That is an important distinction. Belief can begin through another person's witness. The question is not whether testimony played a role. The question is whether testimony becomes a substitute for Jesus or whether it leads toward him. Now the pattern becomes more interesting. John has shown us belief through signs, belief through someone's testimony, belief in response to Jesus' word. And now he gives us a man whose understanding of Jesus seems to unfold step by step. John chapter 9 begins with physical blindness. But by the time the chapter ends, the deeper story is about seeing Jesus more clearly. Jesus heals a man who was blind from birth. Afterward, neighbors begin asking questions. How were your eyes opened? Who did this? The man answers with what he knows. He refers to the man called Jesus. That is true, but it is not yet the fullest thing he will say. Later, when religious leaders question him, they ask what he thinks about Jesus. He says, he is a prophet. His language has moved. Still later, the interrogation becomes more hostile. The leaders insist that they know this man is a sinner. The healed man refuses to claim knowledge he does not have. He gives one of the most memorable responses in the chapter. Whether Jesus is a sinner, he does not know. One thing he does know, he was blind, and now he sees. Then the reasoning continues. He points out that such an act cannot simply be dismissed. By the end of the confrontation, he is saying that if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Again, the recognition has moved. But the story is still not finished. After the man is cast out, Jesus finds him. Jesus asks whether he believes in the Son of Man. The man asks who he is so that he may believe. Jesus identifies himself. And the man responds, Lord, I believe. Then he worships him. John has not given us a chart. He has not labeled 5 stages. We should not take the man called Jesus, prophet, from God, and Lord, I believe, and turn them into a universal conversion formula. John never says that every person must move through those same steps in that same order, but he does show us something important. The man's understanding of Jesus does not appear fully formed in his first recorded sentence. His recognition develops as the story unfolds. Pressure does not end that process. In some ways, it exposes it. The more he is questioned, the more clearly the central issue becomes. Who is Jesus? And by the end, the man is no longer merely describing what Jesus did for his eyes. He is responding to Jesus himself. This matters because Christians can sometimes speak as though real faith must arrive with complete theological understanding from the first moment. John's story is more patient than that. A person may genuinely be moving toward clearer recognition without already being able to articulate everything correctly. But there is an equal danger here. We should not make growth so vague that the actual identity of Jesus stops mattering. John is not simply celebrating spiritual development for its own sake. Belief is going somewhere, and one of the clearest statements of that destination comes from Martha. In John 11, Jesus tells Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Then he asks her directly, do you believe this? Martha does not answer by describing the strength of her feelings. She does not say, I am trying very hard to have faith. She answers with content. She believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. That does not mean Martha understands everything that is about to happen. The rest of the chapter makes clear that she is still facing grief, death, and circumstances larger than her understanding. But her confession tells us something essential. For John, belief is not valuable simply because it is intense. The object matters. Who is Jesus? What is true about him? That question becomes even more uncomfortable in the next scene, because John shows us people who are said to believe, and yet something powerful still controls their behavior. Near the end of John chapter 12, John describes a deeply uncomfortable group, says that even among the rulers, many believed in Jesus. Then he immediately tells us that because of the Pharisees they would not confess him openly because they feared being put out of the synagogue. And John adds a judgment of his own. They loved human glory more than the glory that comes from God. Again, the temptation is to solve the passage too quickly. One person reads it and says, they were obviously never real believers. Another says, they believed, so their fear does not really matter. John gives us neither easy escape. He uses belief language. He also condemns what fear and love of human approval are doing. And the text presents both. And that tension matters. We do not need a complete reconstruction of first-century synagogue discipline to understand the basic stakes John gives us. These rulers fear the social and religious cost of publicly identifying with Jesus. John explicitly connects that fear with exclusion from the synagogue and with their desire for human glory. So the pressure is real in the story, and John says it inhibits open confession. The gospel therefore refuses another simple idea. If belief is genuine, fear disappears immediately. That is not what this passage says. At the same time, John does not celebrate their secrecy as harmless weakness. Fear matters. Human approval matters. What we love matters. The passage does not authorize us to pronounce the eternal destiny of each ruler. But it does authorize us to say that believing language can appear in a life where allegiance is still under serious pressure. That is why the video's question cannot be answered with a dictionary alone. By now we have seen belief connected with signs, with testimony, with Jesus' word, with developing recognition, with clear confession, with fear, with social pressure, and that leaves us with the hardest question of all. If John shows belief in all these different circumstances, what finally holds the gospel's use of this word together? For that, we have to go to Thomas. After Jesus rises from the dead, Thomas is absent when the other disciples see him. They tell Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." That is testimony. The same basic pattern we saw earlier in Samaria appears again. Someone has encountered Jesus and tells someone else. But Thomas refuses to accept their testimony on its own. He says that unless he sees the marks of the nails, puts his finger where the nails were, and puts his hand into Jesus' side, he will not believe. A week later, Jesus appears again. This time Thomas is there. Jesus addresses him directly. He invites Thomas to see and to respond. And Thomas answers with one of the highest confessions in the gospel, "My Lord and my God." Notice how far the story has come. Throughout the gospel, people respond to signs, testimony, words, claims, healing, conflict, and personal encounter. Some responses are immediate, some develop. Some remain complicated, some encounter fear. And now Thomas looks at the risen Jesus and speaks not merely about what Jesus has done. He speaks about who Jesus is, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus says, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That sentence is sometimes treated as though Jesus is praising faith without evidence. But that would be a strange conclusion in John's gospel. John has spent chapter after chapter giving testimony. He has recorded signs. He has preserved words and encounters. And immediately after Thomas's confession, John explains why he wrote what he wrote. Jesus did many other signs that are not recorded in this book. But these have been written so that the reader may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing may have life in his name. That is the destination. John does not resolve the complexity by giving us a hierarchy of believers. He brings the reader back to Jesus. Signs matter because they reveal him. Testimony matters because it points toward him. Jesus' words matter because of who is speaking. Developing understanding matters because the person is coming to recognize Jesus more clearly. Fear matters because allegiance to Jesus is being pressured. Thomas's seeing matters because it leads to his confession. And John's written gospel matters because later readers will not stand in that room with Thomas. We receive testimony. We receive the written signs. We hear the words John has preserved. And John asks what all of this will lead us to believe about Jesus. That is why the same word can appear in such different scenes without meaning that John has secretly invented a different dictionary definition every time. The Gospel keeps pressing the question, who is Jesus? John's answer is not generic spirituality, not faith in faith, not confidence in our own certainty. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and John says life is found in his name. That does not settle every theological question anyone could ask about saving faith. It does not tell us the final spiritual condition of every ambiguous character. It does not tell us why John chose the verb pistuo so often while never using the noun pistis. But it gives us enough to correct the simple assumption we started with. The word believe does not allow us to stop reading. It makes us read more carefully. That changes how we should read John. When you come to a verse that says someone believed, do not rush past the story because you think the word has already answered every question. Look around it. What has this person seen? What have they heard? What are they responding to? What do they understand about Jesus at this point? What fear or misunderstanding remains? And what does John show next? That same care matters when we think about our own faith. There are two opposite mistakes this gospel does not require us to make. The first is complacency. I once said I believe, therefore there is nothing more to examine. John's characters do not allow that kind of mechanical reading. Belief exists in relationship to Jesus. What it rests on matters. Where it points matters. What we love matters. What we do when allegiance becomes costly matters. But the second mistake is panic. My faith has contained questions. I have been afraid. My understanding has grown slowly. I have needed testimony. I have prayed for signs. Therefore, nothing about my faith could ever have been genuine. John's gospel does not give us that formula either. The Samaritan villagers begin with somebody else's testimony. The official responds to Jesus' word before he sees the outcome. The man born blind grows in his recognition of Jesus. Thomas resists the testimony of his closest companions before finally standing before the risen Christ and confessing him as Lord and God. Growth is not the same thing as falseness. Struggle is not automatically unbelief. But neither struggle nor growth should become an excuse to make ourselves the center of faith. John keeps moving the center away from us, away from how strong we feel, away from whether our experience was dramatic enough, away from whether our story looks exactly like somebody else's, and toward Jesus. So perhaps the most useful question is not, do I possess the perfect kind of faith? A better question is, what is my trust resting on, and who is Jesus to me? That is where John's gospel finally takes us. Not to a hidden meaning in the number 98, not to a secret doctrine buried in a missing noun, but to the purpose John states for the book itself, that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name.